Hello, I am Kate Schatz, and I am going to read to you a story from Rad American History A to Z, a book that I wrote that is illustrated by Miriam Kleinstahl. Today I'm going to read the story for the letter D, and in this book, D is for Declaration of Sentiments. Do you know what the Declaration of Sentiments was? Have you heard of Seneca Falls? Do you know who Lucretia Mott is? Do you know what suffrage means? Do you know the history of the struggle for women's right to vote in America? Do you know how the suffrage movement was connected with the abolitionist movement? Great. You'll learn about all those things in this story. Maybe you know some of those things, maybe you're not familiar. That's why I do this work, to tell these really important stories. And I'm going to zoom in on the illustration that Miriam did. It is a paper cut with watercolor in the background. This very stern looking woman in a traditional Quaker bonnet is Lucretia Mott. She's one of my favorite 19th century white lady activists. And behind her is a big list of names, and there's all the people that signed the Declaration of Sentiments, which was a document that is considered by many people to be one of the first documents of the women's rights movement in the United States. So I'm going to read you the story. D is for Declaration of Sentiments, the document that helped spark the women's rights movement. This story takes place in the 19th century, but I begin the story with something that might be familiar to a lot of you, a little reference to hook you in. In a scene from the hit 2015 musical Hamilton, the character Angelica Schuyler talks politics while flirting with Alexander Hamilton. She's been reading Common Sense by Thomas Paine, and that Common Sense was the pamphlet, which was basically like a little book that encouraged the 13 colonies to seek independence from Great Britain. Angelica calls out the Declaration of Independence and its famous opening line, which declares that all men are created equal, but it fails to mention women. And if you know the line, she says, you want a revolution, I want a revelation. So listen to my declaration. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal. But when I meet Thomas Jefferson, I'm going to compel him to include women in the sequel. So a little more than 70 years after the Declaration of Independence was ratified in the 1770s, another declaration came along that would also challenge this omission. So now we're in 1840 at the World Anti-Slavery Convention, which was held in London, again in 1840. Two American women met for the very first time. One was Lucretia Mott, a well-known Quaker abolitionist, and an abolitionist was someone who was committed to ending slavery in the United States or around the world. So Lucretia Mott was one of the first white women in America to publicly call for the immediate end of slavery. She had been selected as a delegate to this convention, which was a gathering of leaders from all over the world who were committed to abolishing slavery, because slavery was not just taking place in the United States. Another woman, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, was honeymooning in Europe with her new husband. They were also active in the abolitionist movement, and they decided to attend the convention. So there they are at this convention. But the leaders of the convention, who were all men, all British men, who claimed to be committed to universal liberty, meaning that everyone in the world should have liberty and freedom, they were not exactly excited about American women attending the event, no matter how committed these women might be to the cause. The men felt it was inappropriate for women to speak in public or to be in positions of leadership. The entire first day of the convention was spent debating whether to allow American women to participate in the convention at all. Their final decision? The women could attend, but they had to sit in a separate section. They could watch the convention, but they could not speak. Lucretia was angry, but she was no stranger to exclusion. She and a number of free Black women back in the United States, including Charlotte Fortin and her daughters, had founded the Philadelphia Female Anti-Slavery Society, because the American Anti-Slavery Society, which was one of the biggest abolitionist groups, did not allow women. Elizabeth, who was younger and hadn't experienced as much of this sort of prejudice, was outraged. How could men claim to believe in freedom for everyone if they were not going to respect women? In her memoir, Elizabeth Cady Stanton recalls that she and Lucretia Mott walked together after the convention, and they decided that they should have their own convention back home in America to discuss the status and rights of women. 8 years later, this idea became a reality. In the years following the London Convention, Lucretia had continued her role as a leader in the anti-slavery movement, while Elizabeth had moved from her bustling Boston neighborhood to a more isolated home in Seneca Falls, New York. Her husband Henry traveled a lot, and she grew lonely and frustrated with her limited domestic life. And Elizabeth Cady Stanton had 7 children. So there she is in Seneca Falls, small town, with 7 kids, and Henry's always traveling. When a local abolitionist named Jane Hunt heard that the very famous Lucretia Mott was coming to town, she invited Elizabeth and several other women to join Lucretia for tea. The 5 guests included Lucretia's sister, Martha Coffin Wright, and Mary Ann McClintock, another abolitionist woman whose house was a stop on the Underground Railroad and whose husband owned a shop that refused to sell products made by slave labor. And that was one of the various tactics for abolitionists, for white abolitionists, especially shop owners, that they would refuse to sell anything that was made by slave labor. So a lot of the cotton that was picked by slave labor, they would refuse to sell anything that had cotton in it that came from slave labor. So over tea, these women discussed the challenges that they faced as women. As Elizabeth recalled in her memoir, they decided then and there to call for a women's rights convention. Because they wanted Lucretia to be a featured speaker, they decided to hold the convention quickly, like that same week, before she planned to return to Philadelphia. That very evening, they placed an ad in the local paper announcing, quote, a convention to discuss the social, civil, and religious condition and rights of women. They quickly found a local church that was willing to host them, and they began to plan the event. The most important order of business was to write a document to sum up the event's purpose and the organizers' concerns. They decided to use the Declaration of Independence as their model, and together they drafted a new document that boldly replaced the colonists' grievances against the king with their own grievances against men. And you'll recall that the Declaration of Independence was that list of the colonists' complaints against the King of England, and laying out what they actually wanted in their new country. So the original declaration indicted the British king for the establishment of an absolute tyranny of these United States. The new document that the women wrote argued that the history of mankind has resulted in repeated injuries and usurpations, it's kind of a hard word, usurpations, on the part of man toward woman, and an absolute tyranny over her. So they basically took the language of the Declaration of Independence and the ideas from it, and they tweaked it to refer to the condition of women. They completed a draft during that very first meeting. Elizabeth edited and revised it at home over the next few days. The Declaration of Sentiments, as they called it, became the first widely published American Manifesto of women's rights. Like the original Declaration of Independence, the Declaration of Sentiments listed 18 grievances, which are complaints, about the condition of women. They wrote about how women were denied equal pay, the right to own property, access to higher education, jobs in fields like law and medicine, a say in the laws that govern their bodies, and once they were married, any rights whatsoever. And this is before women could own property. So once a woman got married, she had all of her money, any inheritance that a woman had, any inheritance that a white woman had, would automatically become her husband's, etc. It also criticized men for preventing women from exercising their, quote, inalienable right to the elective franchise. In other words, the right to vote. And like the original, their declaration ended with a demand by insisting that women have immediate admission to all the rights and privileges which belong to them as citizens of these United States. The women did not know how many attendees to expect for their hastily planned convention. But 1 week after that first meeting, on the morning of July 19th, 1848, about 300 people showed up. They gathered outside the Wesleyan Methodist Church in Seneca Falls at 10 a.m. Many of the people who showed up were experienced activists in other movements. Again, a lot of them were part of the abolitionist movement. Many of them were part of the temperance movement and other social reform movements of the mid-19th century. Even though the announcement had specified that the convention was for women only, a number of men did come, and some women brought their young sons. Elizabeth welcomed the crowd, and then Lucretia spoke, urging people to consider women's rights as a part of reforms in general. So Lucretia's commitment to social equality was focused not just on women, but on the rights of all disadvantaged people. Before her trip to Seneca Falls, she was basically on a tour. And she had been traveling to meet with a bunch of people. She had been meeting with members of the Seneca Indian tribe. She went to Canada and met with newly free Black men and women who had escaped enslavement and had gone to Canada. And she also visited with inmates in a nearby prison. Then, so after she gave her talk, again, in which she talked about the rights of women as connected to this larger movement for liberty and freedom for all people, then it was time to introduce the Declaration of Sentiments to the audience. Elizabeth began by reading the entire thing out loud. Then she went back and she read it paragraph by paragraph, going over each of their resolutions in detail. Then the crowd discussed and debated each demand thoroughly, examining whether or not it should be included in their final declaration. This whole process took basically all day. On the second day of the convention, everybody came back. And actually even more people came back the second day. When it came time to vote on the resolutions in the Declaration of Sentiments, the demand for voting rights or women's suffrage was actually the most controversial. Even Lucretia Mott opposed this, which I always find so interesting, and I didn't know that until I did this research. But her reasons were different. For Lucretia, she believed that the American political and economic system was so bound up with the evils of slavery that it must be completely restructured, and that any effort to work within the political system was a compromise with slavery, which she refused. So she basically felt that the entire system needed to be completely, revolutionized. So she did eventually come to support women's suffrage. But in 1848, while slavery still raged, voting to her meant participating in an immoral and corrupt system. In other words, Lucretia was hardcore. The convention was on the verge of eliminating the suffrage provision when Frederick Douglass stood up. So Frederick Douglass was a formerly enslaved abolitionist. He was a very famous public speaker. He was also probably the only Black person in attendance at the convention. We do not know for sure because there's not an entire record of every single person that was at this convention, but it is highly likely that he was the only African American person there. Certainly, we don't have any record of there being any Black women there, but Frederick Douglass was there. He and Lucretia Mott agreed on many, many things, but he did believe in using electoral politics to bring about change. So he wanted to support this idea of women's suffrage. He stood up. He gave an impromptu, impassioned speech, and he insisted that suffrage be included. And he declared that it is the duty of the women of this country to secure to themselves their sacred right to the elective franchise. The audience was convinced, and the demand for women's suffrage remained in the Declaration, but it was the only resolution that was passed narrowly. Of the several hundred people in attendance, 100 of them signed their names to the Declaration of Sentiments, just as the founders had committed themselves to their new set of American principles. But unlike the original Declaration of Independence, this declaration bore the names of 68 women along 32 men. Several decades later, Frederick Douglass reflected on what it meant for him as a Black man to support women's suffrage in its early days. He said that when he ran away from slavery, it was for himself. He said, "When I advocated emancipation, it was for my people. But when I stood up for the rights of women, self was out of the question." So would anyone even notice that 300 people had crowded into a church in a small town in upstate New York to declare that women in America should have the right to own property, live independently, and be able to vote? Would anyone care about the new declaration? Elizabeth and her collaborators were certain that their efforts would be criticized, and they were definitely right. Newspapers in states all over the place picked up the story. One article called it the most shocking and unnatural incident ever recorded in the history of womanity. Womanity. I don't even know if that's actually a word. The article said, if our ladies will insist on voting, where, gentlemen, will be our dinners? But Frederick Douglass, he published a very, very popular abolitionist newspaper called the North Star. It published the Declaration of Sentiments, the entire thing, and it praised the bravery of all who attended the convention. Another newspaper said that Lucretia Mott's opening speech was one of the most eloquent, logical, and philosophical discourses which we have ever listened to. So, mixed reviews. The Declaration of Sentiments helped connect the ideas of women's rights to many other social, political, and economic facets of America, from income inequality to education to religion to the emotional toll of sexism. It sparked the movement for women's suffrage, and it helped inaugurate a long and brave fight to make gender equality in America a reality. Conditions did improve for many women in America in the decades that followed. More women gained access to higher education, to careers in law and medicine, and to greater rights within their marriages. But other rights were long deferred. It would be another 70 years before the 19th Amendment guaranteed most women, mainly white women, the right to vote, and another 120 years until the Civil Rights Act outlawed many of the barriers still handicapping the full enfranchisement of women of color. And for more about that, you'll see V for voting rights on page 135. One outcome of the Seneca Falls Convention is also what came next. The authors of the Declaration closed by hoping that, quote, this convention will be followed by a series of conventions embracing every part of the country. And that is what happened. Women's rights activists organized, lectured, and held women's rights conventions every year in multiple states for decades. With the exception of the Civil War years. That was the only time that they stopped. But those conventions continued for the rest of the 19th century into the early 20th century. Their enduring efforts moved the demands of the Declaration of Sentiments forward, and they shaped the American fight for suffrage and gender equality. So that is our story of the Declaration of Sentiments. And this was one of the most interesting stories for me to research, I would say, in part because I really thought that I knew a lot about this story, and then I realized that I didn't. And there's a lot of different ways that scholars and historians have been writing about it and thinking about it. And one of the things is that people will often say that Seneca Falls was the birthplace of the women's rights movement. And I've been to Seneca Falls. This is where the National Women's History Museum is. You can actually go to the church where this whole convention happened. It was like turned into like a dry cleaners for a long time in the 60s and 70s, but now they've restored it and you can go in there. And then there is a museum there. So I've traveled there. And again, it's often referred to as that convention was the moment when the women's rights movement began. And that's just not really true. It was really notable. It was really significant. It was a big turning point. But women had been speaking out in favor of their rights for decades before that. And again, I think one of the most important things for people to understand about the suffrage movement and the fight for women's right to vote is that it absolutely came out of the abolitionist movement. So the people who were really advocating for women's rights, women's right to vote, women's right to own property, were people who were also speaking out about ending slavery. And that was absolutely not just white women. The abolitionist movement was fully driven by women of color, by Black women, by men as well, but women were front and center in the abolitionist movement. And it's a time period that is super fascinating to me. And we talk about voting rights and the women's movement and many other stories in this book, but that's kind of where it starts in this book. So thank you very much for listening, and I'll be back with the next story in the book, which is E for Earth First. We'll get some environmental activism.